much. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the first of today's panel discussions. The topic is a very interesting one, a very topical one, but really about how we're seeing the big carrier debate trundling along at present. The industry is at a very interesting phase of its development right now, so I think we're going to have a really interesting dialogue over the next hour or so, and we've got a fantastic panel to get this dialogue going. But, you know, if we think about, you know, what are the big drivers of the industry at the moment? We live in an increasingly borderless world in the digital age. Value chains and ecosystems are becoming ever more interconnected across TMT and beyond. At the same time, customer needs are changing faster than ever, while new technologies like SDN to 5G promise to radically alter the infrastructure landscape. But before we go into the questions, you know, let's set the scene. A few numbers about where the wholesale market is at present. You know, it was worth about $175 billion last year. This is going to climb to $210 billion by 2021, accounting for 11% of the entire telecoms market. And while revenues from traditional voice will fall against a backdrop of growing commoditization of VoIP take-up, data is the growth area, and I think, you know, that's pretty clear. Fastest growing regions, emerging markets potentially, we'll drill into some of those kind of, you know, regional specificities, if you like, going forward. But while there are plenty of diversification opportunities, it's all about being agile in this increasingly interconnected environment. And actually some research that we've done at EY, where we regularly speak to the operator community, finds that actually disruptive competition remains the #1 threat cited by a lot of telcos. A lack of organizational agility is also sort of high on the radar of challenges. And when it comes to priorities, it's all about shifting to data-led and digital business models. So first off, I think, you know, we're going to try and sort of, you know, build the conversation looking at kind of the demand side and then thinking about the supply side, moving on to considering, you know, partnerships and then this question of agility. So, you know, when it comes to customer demand in the broadest sense, you know, we know there are 5 billion unique mobile users, 3.7 billion internet users. That's just the consumer side, but there's also the Internet of Things now moving into focus, 8.4 billion connected objects. Pierre-Louis, perhaps starting with you, you know, what does this explosion in data demand and this shift towards data, these new customer types, how do you see this playing out?
So what we see clearly in the networks is a multiplication by 2 of the IP traffic, and it's a steady growth, 100% of growth everywhere, so that's huge, and mainly due to the number of connected objects, so not only your phone, but also your watch, now your car, your fridge, a lot of Internet of Things connected to the network. It's also a matter of new usage, so a lot of video of streaming and also gaming industry. Now esports starting to use a lot of bandwidth, and also virtual reality with your helmets, which is a huge need of bandwidth in IP traffic. So really we are facing this, and we need to adapt to this continuously growing demand.
Sure. Very, very interesting on you know, in terms of the IoT and the verticalization of demand there. Mark, you know, when we think about the kind of regional perspective, we know that, you know, a lot of globally applicable themes, if you like. But if we think maybe about sort of demand in Asia, or, you know, the various stages of growth that different Asian markets are at, or we look at Africa, where, you know, there's this need for affordable bandwidth, there's the untapped potential of, you know, content potentially. What's your take on that, and how demand varies by region?
I think that consumer demand in Asia, to follow on, for instance, from Pierre-Louis' comment about gamers and so on, in Asia we can see arguably some of the most advanced applications being deployed at a consumer level most aggressively. In Hong Kong domestically, quite regularly, we offer 10 gig to the home, fibered up more than 90% of homes in Hong Kong. You see similar types of applications and capabilities in Korea and in Japan and Singapore, certainly in the developed side of Asia. Now some absolutely crazy development from my point of view applicationally in mainland China. It's rare now for someone in mainland China to actually use currency. Everything is is done on their mobile phone. The integration of WeChat with Uber-style apps in China is arguably more advanced than in the West. And in that regard, underneath it all, from a wholesale perspective, we need to be savvy with regard to bandwidth development. You're seeing an increasing number of undersea cables in the Pacific region as a result, far more than I had anticipated, let's say 10 years ago at this stage, despite the fact that we did read bandwidth demands correctly in our forecast at that time. And so you're seeing a real jump. When you compare, you asked about Africa, the comparison there is that I think that the GDP in Africa still hasn't facilitated as much growth, and at the same time you see that ICT investment in Africa is also facilitating some of that GDP growth. And interestingly, you're seeing a lot of investment going from Asia to Africa, and in that regard we are following our customers, so to speak, and investing in that environment as well, because we see that as an opportunity downstream. So comparatively, I think Asia Pacific is to focus on the advanced applications in bandwidth development, and in Africa to help set the road for what will come over time, and to watch the ICT timeline evolve in different regions at different times.
Sure, sure. Very, very interesting there, and the contrast between regions. Alessandro, I mean, you know, from a more European perspective, but also thinking maybe about the Middle East, what do you see as the big drivers going forward?
Yeah, it's probably the same as we see in Asia, in US. Bandwidth demand is very high. We see an increase year on year, that is unbelievable. And we need to be ready with the network capability to serve all this amount of capacity and bandwidth requirements. Fortunately, the technology today are available and can guarantee more efficiency in the transport layer, in the management service layer. So Europe is becoming interesting for one fact. I mean, the first fact is that we don't have enough capacity. We don't have enough network availability, and we need to deploy new network. Unbelievable. This was something on which 10 years ago, someone told us, saying, you have enough capacity for the next 20 years. Now, after 5 years, we don't have capacity. We invested with our business plan saying we have a return that is more than 5 years. So how to guarantee the economy, all the economics in the Europe is very challenging. Second message, Europe is becoming very competitive, the price is very low, capacity is taken for free, and this is another aspect that I wanted to remark in terms of market, in terms of affordability, in terms of addressability of the market. Then Middle East is very interesting because of the peculiarity. Middle East means more than nothing. I mean, it's specific regions, specific countries as different needs, and with different political and geographical aspects. We try to develop our network starting from the East Europe. We are developing a very good relation in the Middle East by means of Saudi Arabia and Emirates as well. We are present in Iran. We see with lots of interest Pakistan. And the possibility of also creating a corridor that could be an intra-regional corridor. That doesn't mean we need to flow the traffic from the east to the west, but to guarantee an efficient cache way of managing content inside the intra-region as the network would be ready to serve such big amount of capacity. Then in terms of investments, Europe would be different from Middle East. In terms of reliability and capability, probably the same, but the service we have to manage make some challenges in our network, and we have to be ready with our engineer. We need to have people ready to work in different way in the technology side, in all the layers of the network. This is a very, very quick explanation of what is happening. in my opinion.
That's great. No, I mean, a very detailed perspective there. Thank you. And Dan, moving to you, maybe with a bit more of a sort of stateside focus, how do you see demand changing and evolving right now, and what's important from your perspective in terms of the growth agenda?
Yeah, and first I'd like to thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel. As a small carrier, to be on a big carrier debate panel is pretty nice. So
That's
thank
great.
you.
He's modest, he's not so big, so he's
Tiny
modest.
compared to
He's a giant, according to what we see.
When Zayo thinks of its business plan and its position in industry, we think of the word infrastructure more than we think of the word carrier. So when we think about infrastructure, we don't necessarily differentiate between is the customer, quote unquote, a carrier, or is a customer something that we would typically think of as a carrier but has carrier-like needs. For these types of customers, what they're looking to do is get more control over their underlying network. Okay, they don't want to just, quote unquote, buy bandwidth. They want to build a network that is tailored to their traffic and application flow patterns. If you're designing a network from the vantage point of Amazon, that's going to look a lot different than if you're designing a network from the vantage point of Google. Those two companies sound somewhat similar, but if you think about their applications, the flow of traffic, where it needs to home into, what kind of applications they're making available, the network optimization challenge that they face are very different from one another. Therefore, they want to have the building blocks in order to configure their network. So building blocks include fiber in certain areas. It certainly includes space and power, or colo. It includes wavelengths, and it includes Ethernet services, not just for themselves, but also how their customers will be able to more directly connect into their networks, into their cloud environments. In fact, today we think of direct connect in the cloud environments as being solely a lit service, Ethernet or maybe IPVPN, maybe wavelengths. But there's also the concept I think is going to start to emerge, which is fiber attaching into cloud networks. Like, why not, if you're a major enterprise that is heavily reliant on Microsoft or Google or Amazon, why not use a dark fiber connection to get diversity from your headquarters into an edge node that is your service provider, and then connect into their network and have them carry you into their cloud environment where you have more predictable performance and more of a seamless experience. We think those kind of services are going to emerge. So when we think about where things are going, we kind of have a different vantage point in that we look at it from the infrastructure kind of lens and how can we serve and enable kind of a broad set of customers, including carriers, but a bit beyond carriers as well.
Oh, that's great, Dan, and very interesting to hear about this sort of enabling focus and that infrastructure centricity. I guess, there's one way of looking at the market is thinking about demand, but there's also enabling technologies that are really helping operators to innovate their propositions, overhaul their business models and approaches. I think, one key topic, across the telco industry, retail, wholesale, is really the changing relationship, I guess, between hardware and software in the network and the rise of SDN. And, if we look at sort of the investment picture in terms of the software-defined network, we can see that, investment levels are rising at a sort of 50% CAGR over the next 5 years. So it's really ramping up at the moment. And these are spread typically over a range of domains, whether it's transport, CDNs, policy control, etc. So it's a really transformative technology. I mean, Mark, just turning to you on this, and PCCW has been very involved in this, but I mean, do you see, where do you see the industry right now in terms of its migration to software-defined networks, and how far along the curve are we?
I think you have to sort of track a path in terms of software development, the relationship between networks, vendors, and how software has sort of taken hold. One thing that we need to note is the very rapid evolution of software development behavior around open source and how that's driving behavior and creating applications that are valued. Second is an increasing interest for the digital platform economy where successful service basically means exposing the back end directly to a customer and taking out the middleman in almost every activity. When you take the development cycles associated with open source that have been expedited so rapidly, you combine that with consumer demand to avoid middlemen and to simply be able to order directly, combine that with the applications that have evolved in software optimization, in network optimization through software, you're getting to the basics of SDN. Add on top of that the demand from large enterprises and now service providers to virtualize basic hardware configurations into software environment in order to either reduce CapEx or provide payment on an on-demand, add an X as a service payment model, and you have the new world. And if service providers, as opposed to network providers, aren't willing to adapt to that environment, they'll be left really to, as Dan is describing, fiber and cloud, and that's it, and nothing in between. So it's critical that we as service providers engage in that software process in a way that's intelligent, convert legacy infrastructure for pre-existing customers and provide them the applicational capability in a software-defined world. And that's some of the things that we're trying to do through some small acquisitions and to reshape our organization to accommodate it.
Very interesting, and this notion that relationships within the industry can become more frictionless and more dynamic as a result of this paradigm
I don't know
shift.
if they become frictionless.
Alessandro, in terms of, Sparkle's being active in NFV, what's your take on that, and how does it fit into your organization's roadmap?
Yes, it's we are active since we are working at the international level with some other operators and vendors to try to understand how the architecture of the future network will be. It is strictly depending on the evolution of clouds and data centers in the market, and this requires a different approach, a different model, how you design your network. I have probably three drivers. One is abstract, means try to simplify the complexity of the network. Programmability, that means you have to be ready to develop a software development on the application interfaces, API, and virtualization. Virtualization is the way how you can share resources, you can manage the same source with the different users, and you can demand different in the network depending on the services that you have to realize or to deliver. The fact is that if we take cardinal points, north is the service delivery and south is the infrastructure, the fiber optics, we need to insert, to manage as much as possible in an open source way and in a very standard way the interfaces, the relation between the network and the service delivered. This is not because only for being more efficient because of CapEx allocation, but because you need interoperability. And you need interoperability at all the levels of the network and of the services. So you need to interoperate at application level, infrastructure, transport level, IP level, port level, whatever it is, you need to be transparent in the network. Our customers are requiring bandwidth on demand. They ask for a more efficient allocation of the bandwidth. They ask for cost reduction, for quality, for reducing latency, delivery, provisioning. That's all those drivers means you need to reinvent, rethink about how you drive all the operation in the company, and not only how you deal with your neighbor, how you interoperate. Mm-hmm. This is the way how we see NFV in our network.
That's very interesting, particularly around the sort of the repercussions, I guess, on the operating model and what it means for the organization. Yeah. I think, we can talk about, hardware, software, that shifting dividing line. But, if we think about, the next big CapEx cycle coming up, we're really thinking about 5G, and it's a very topical area at the moment. Particularly in its enabling role for the Internet of Things. I mean, Dan, sort of thinking about what's going on in the States at the moment. There's a lot of spectrum being released, being repurposed. What do you think this means for the wholesale telco, the carrier market at large, the 5G and the shift to that new technology?
Sure. So it wasn't very long ago, maybe even as recently as 3 or 4 years ago, that I'd get questions like, boy, won't wireless make fiber obsolete? Or, geez, when someone leases dark fiber, does that mean that you'll never have an opportunity to sell them again? Or isn't there way too much fiber in the ground already? I mean, when Zayo started in 2007, we faced those questions over and over and over again. We don't get those questions anymore. Something happened, and most of it was related to 5G, some of it related to cloud, that was like a collective light bulb that went off throughout the industry. What people started to realize was that there's an interrelationship that's pretty permanent in nature, permanent at least in our careers and in our lifetimes, that wireless and fiber will feed off of each other. The way you get more bandwidth out of spectrum is to densify, to get radios closer to what they're trying to serve, and then as quickly as possible, attach those radios to fiber. But it's not enough just to attach them to kind of a fiber ring that connects a whole bunch of different nodes. There's this trade-off between fiber and optronics. That is, if you have an ample supply of fiber, you could do architectures that connect radios directly into cloud-based hubs that are not in the base station or not where the small cell is. It's a mile away, a couple miles away. And by having direct fiber connections to each of these radios, you can not only take advantage of densification, but you could spend less money to build your network. So having fiber count matters. In some cases, having lots of fiber, hundreds of fibers are what a lot of customers are looking for. And they're looking for those fibers to go to a lot of different points. And they're not just looking for you to drop the fiber off, they're looking for you to do more than that, to get them somewhere to hang their radio, somewhere where you bring power to that device in addition to fiber so that it behaves as a network. So a lot of the capital investment, I think that's going to drive, at least in the US and probably Europe, is the densification of these networks driven by 5G. A lot of fiber demand, a lot of industry players trying to fill each other out as to who should play what role in that emerging ecosystem.
Very interesting to think about, the densification of the network, and actually original point about the relationship between wireless and fiber, because you're right, it was only a few years ago that there was this notion of displacement, as we shifted technologies. When we think about sort of, the opportunity for sure, enabling technologies and new advancements, playing a key role undoubtedly here. But also, this shift to the digital era brings with it risks. And, if we think about cybersecurity, this more densely interconnected ecosystem also introduces new threats, new vulnerabilities. And, some of the research that we've done shows that carriers, 50% of them are predicting an uptick in their security budgets over the next year. Pierre-Louis, we're seeing a lot of sort of high-profile attacks at the moment, private sector, public sector targets, increasing critical infrastructure attacks. What can wholesalers do to help mitigate and lessen these risks for their customers? And what role do you see for them playing in the value chain?
Yes, you are right. Cybercriminality is one of the major topics we have to address, if not the major topics. And if in all our services, whatever we are talking about voice, whatever we are talking about data and IP traffic, whatever we are talking also about mobile activity, we have to fight this kind of cybercriminality, which is increasing. Every day, big and large companies have hundreds of attacks. So really, we have to protect our customers, retail customers, B2B customers, and operator customers. We have to protect our employees. We have to protect our own networks, which are, as we said before, more and more software-driven, that is to say, more and more attacks. And really, what I would like to say is the key things we have to achieve is to cooperate. Because attacks can come from whatever country to attack whatever enterprise in the world, so we need, as different carriers, to cooperate between ourselves, because we have to fight very actively against those guys, which come from whatever, as I said, and we are really to cooperate between ourselves. If Sparkle, Telecommunications Sparkle has a problem, Orange has a problem, and vice versa, I consider we have really to fight together.
Absolutely, that's very interesting how it's kind of a shared responsibility for everybody in this age of the partnership. Mark, PCCW Global's ramping up its cyber offerings and, through the acquisition of Cryptea, etc. How do you see the landscape playing out in terms of things to watch for or issues that might be rising up the customer agenda?
First, let me also echo what Pierre-Louis was saying yesterday at the Global Leaders Forum. Actually, we've consistently been pushing forward this message internally, and I think that there's common agreement amongst many of the carriers that we have to, perhaps without making too much noise, but the message is that we must collaborate on the security issue amongst us. It's not, at least in terms of network security, that's an area that shouldn't be defined as a competitive message, but rather one as a collaborative one, particularly in the very interconnected environment that we live in, particularly at the IP layer. And so thank you, Pierre-Louis, for mentioning that, because it's quite critical, the collaboration message. And for those of you involved in network security in the room, I hope that you also involve yourselves in the effort. From our perspective, we invested a few years ago in Cryptea Networks. We saw algorithmic capability. We saw that as the notion of being able to provide security operations center capabilities that would be able to cover not just the basic DDoS activities, but also malware assessments and other forms of fraudulent behavior that can impact networks in various ways. The opportunity there we see as an offering that can be of value to an enterprise. We see security delivered holistically, both as an algorithmic capability that can be deployed in a network, but also as providing a holistic security operations center capability that would assist enterprises or other service providers to get a better view on what's happening globally across their infrastructure. But security is a big word, and it's like saying telecom, right? And you have to then get into the specifics of how that's done, what are the nuances, and how that's packaged, and what's the most appropriate approach. And I'm not sure that there's any one single player that has the complete solution on how that's done, and it's becoming increasingly challenging to manage. And I would argue that within 5 years' time, you'll see certain security components delivered as simply drop-ins along with basic connectivity infrastructure along the lines that we were describing before.
Mm-hmm. I mean, very interesting you mentioned the management of the issue. I mean, it's such a far-reaching topic, and depending on where you're sat in the world or what type of service you provide or what kind of partner ecosystem you're part of, I mean, there's a lot to grapple with there.
There's two sides to the story. Certainly large enterprises, public companies, they now have CISOs, their boards are requiring audit, and there's risk officers and all of these, and EY is focused on it from a compliance perspective, and you bring in your compliance inspectors, and everybody's got to tick the dots. But at the end of the day, there's operational behavior that needs to take place. Mm-hmm. Say, how do you protect a device? How do you protect an application? And how do you assure that these things are not threatening how your business functions? And I think that the world of compliance, audit, and risk management that's happening at the board level and corporate level is very different than operational behavior. But hopefully, as this topic evolves over the next 5 years or so, people will get a better handle on it. But operational management, audit, and risk management somehow is seen holistically by senior executives as one and the same. I would argue that it's probably just a little bit different.
Right. Interesting to bear in mind the nuances there. And actually, very interesting that, but both of you mentioned partnerships, because that was the next kind of topic or theme, really, just to think around this interconnectedness of the ecosystem. And actually, what it means. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of, positive associations of increased partnership, but also that, that management of the customer experience, the management of, different ambitions, the alignment of, different incentives maybe to be part of partnerships. If we think, maybe actually of the role of partnerships in entering new markets, for example. I mean, Alessandro, for you, Sparkle's kind of building out its footprint, partnerships playing an important role. What's your take on, the opportunities, but also the challenges of partnering in the ecosystem?
Yeah, it's, of course, is one of the important items on which we have to work, especially when we need, you mentioned the customer experience. And you mentioned many times the way how customers need to have to be served. Our experience is they need to have the maximum level of service, and we need to fulfill service also when we are not ready in our network to integrate. And that we need, for this reason, we need partnership. We need partnership at technical level. We need partnership at the service delivery, service creation level, and in the market. One of the main actors when we integrate services are the system integrators. System integrators, they are playing a role that probably they are more successful in the retail market than in the wholesale market. We see lots of problems when we try to have an integration of new services in our network because of the experience. As a carrier, we started building our own network, embedding our services, and that's it. Now, the requirement is you have a decent market, you have to expand, you have to integrate your service, and not only IP transport, and not only manage bandwidth, but you need to have managed services. You need to work on the security, you need to work on the bandwidth on demand. That's life. I mean, a partner can help us a lot. Partnership, I sponsor a partnership, for example, to integrate our sales channel, to be ready to sell more. I sponsor partnership when we need to increase the skills inside our company to be sure that we are able to avoid any legacy in the next future, and to be as much as possible agile. There's a different approach if we look at the different regions in the world. Europe and US are the most advanced in terms of building a partnership, building also a program for partnership, and something different and on which we have to work on the other places. Very bad situation in Africa, where it's not sufficient to have a partner, because you need to have probably more public and private partnership than partnership per se. So the number of partnership for a carrier, global carrier like we are a lot, really a lot. It's very also difficult for our legal department to work on thousands of papers to be sure that you are guaranteed, but it's okay. It's a good thing. We see that the market is asking, the demand is there, and we do that.
That's interesting, yeah, because I mean, certainly, looking at the news flow in recent years, I mean, the market's so partner-centric, and what demands does that place on the organisation? A very interesting one. But also, I mean, we can talk about partnerships, but then there's also, acquisitions, and we're seeing a lot of M&A happening at the moment, across the telco sector. Lots of consolidation deals, more ambitious, convergence-oriented deals. Dan, maybe turning to you and just thinking about, Zayo's own role in terms of, building scale out. What do you see as, what does the horizon look like in terms of, say, consolidation, for example? And what do you see as maybe some of the challenges as companies go on the acquisition trail?
Sure. So I mentioned the light bulb that went off about 3 years ago. I kind of pined for when the world existed before that light bulb went off, because it was a lot easier acquiring valuable companies for perhaps less than they were really worth than it is today. So part of the realization of the importance of infrastructure has led to kind of a flurry of M&A activity that has raised the prices for doing acquisitions. Now, the question is, has it raised it too much? You know, are there deals being done where the buyer is paying too much for the company that they're acquiring? That's a question that I think is a fair question, but one that really isn't going to be answerable until another 5 years or so goes by. Certainly there'll be some mistakes that have been made, but whether there's a general situation now where the M&A activity has gotten to the point where the prices being paid for at least infrastructure companies is at the point where the buyers may regret having done the deals down the road. One of the hardest things that I'm dealing with right now in my job is knowing when to say no, not just from an M&A standpoint, but even some of the commercial deals that we do that are very capital intensive. Those tended to be easier decisions 4 or 5 years ago, based on the economics of the deals, than they are today, because of the zealousness of some of the competition for those types of deals. So we have to know when it's okay to lose a deal, because we don't see the clarity of economics relative to the capital that needs to be spent. Or it's okay to not be the highest bidder on a company that we'd like to acquire, but we just can't get comfortable enough with the price. So maybe we'll regret saying no on some of the things we've said no to recently, but there's not clarity in the answer. So it is a more heightened environment now than it was 3 or 4 years ago.
Right, very interesting. Yeah, and it's it's a big question, I guess. If you look at the M&A landscape across the entire telco sector, how far can it go? Because we have seen a number of big deals in recent years. So we kind of thought about the demand side, the supply side, the tech landscape. This big issue of security, and that kind of led naturally into a kind of conversation about partnerships. But sort of thinking about this whole question of agility, if you sort of move beyond the innovation of the service proposition, trying to tap new forms of customer demand. I guess, one of the things that, we at EY discover in our conversations with carriers is this notion of how the organization needs to change to adapt to the wider external factors, whether it's customer demand or technology change. Pierre-Louis, just sort of thinking about, this concept of digitization and this kind of the shift in business model. What does it mean for a carrier to make the most of the opportunity in terms of how the carrier works, how the organization works, and the culture works?
Just in one word, we have to become a software company. In fact, we are going to shift from a kind of hardware company to a software company and providing applications. So we still have to provide the physical layer. Obviously, we'll have to connect the homes, the buildings, the antennas, the 4G or 5G antennas. So we'll have to provide this layer, but we have to become more and more software-oriented, providing, for example, bandwidth on demand. This is just an example. And also, just to give on the retail side an example, on Orange, we are also already providing a payment facility. So we have payment applications. So this is what we provide to our customers, and we have to change our organization. It's a matter of new organization, new processes, new skills also. We have to find new skills in the market to shift to a software company.
Very interesting. Everybody's becoming a software company, even an infrastructure specialist, right? Does any of the rest of the panel have any thoughts about sort of organizational change? And, I'm sort of thinking here, we find that when we ask what are the big barriers to transformation, 2 things come up very strongly. One is the legacy footprint, particularly in IT, for example. And secondly, the lack of digital skill sets or new skill sets. Perhaps that's data scientists, perhaps it's software specialisms. But those are the 2 twin pain points. And any thoughts from the panel on that?
Happy to pitch in. I think that Anytime that you're trying to make change organically from a legacy environment to a new environment, it's going to be a slow process. And so probably it makes sense to make even small acquisitions that can, on the one hand, not create an earthquake in your organization, but at the same time still shake it up, give it a bit of a tremor in order to create some value. But then it becomes necessary to continuously evolve that process. Also, software development itself is becoming, by definition, internally using the word agile. Again, I go back to what I had said at my introduction with regard to open source and how that is permeating almost everything that's going on in a business. And so you need an organization that's willing to understand truly what agile development is, to have people that would head the organization that understand that. And if you're willing to shake things up, then you might discover that the softwareization of your capabilities can, in and of itself, become the core of productization. And that's an additional shake-up in an organization. Instead of software being just IT, but rather, in and of itself, becoming the productization component of what you do, that would be the major shift. And I think that's something that we, as so-called network-based organizations, as we shift to software, will need to look more at that.
Sure, very, very interesting.
Yeah, so I often talk about the scale and scope paradox in our industry. So the scale and scope paradox. We're in a network business. In a network business, the more scale you have, the more of an advantage that should be. That is, the more network, the more data center facilities, and the more scope you have, the more applications and revenue and services you can layer on top of your network. That also should be an advantage. So why is that a paradox? Because the companies who've created the most value in the last 10 or 20 years in our industry have not had scale advantages, nor have they had scope advantages. In fact, they've done things like focus on a single product, like co-location, and they call themselves Equinix, or like CDNs, and they call themselves Akamai. Even IP services, which we all perceive as the most competitive services, I don't know if you've noticed what Cogent is trading at, but it's at like 15 times EBITDA, and it's been there for a long period of time, and just going along, implementing a strategy without much network, without much product, but being very profitable and creating a lot of value for their shareholders. Why? Hopefully, no one from Amazon is in this room. Why did Amazon, a bookseller, why were they the ones who developed cloud in a highly scalable way? Why wasn't it AT&T or IBM or HP? So the scale and scope paradox is something we're not getting right. We're not taking advantage of scale and scope, and I think it has to do with agility, maintaining the entrepreneurial spirit, knowing kind of your assets really well locally, while you get bigger and broader and take advantage of that scale. So I think that's a key to continue to create value as you become bigger and more complex.
Very interesting, and this, the questioning this whole notion of scale and scope and actually what it means. And you're right to flag some of these high-growth companies have started from a very particular specialism, right, to broaden their, a hold over the ecosystem. With about 10 minutes to go now, and I know lunch is coming up at 12:30, but it might be a good time to open the discussion up to the floor and see if anyone from the audience has any questions for our panel. Of course.
But we really stimulated a lot of thought from this crowd, didn't we?
Well, I mean, I guess, taking further forward this question of, agility and what it means, how far do you think, business models can travel in the next, 3 to 5 years? If we think about the broadening of service portfolios and different propositions, and do we have any thoughts on that, about how wide the service portfolio can actually get?
It's very difficult to guess how wide, but what I wanted to say is to come back on Dan's comment about 5G, which is going to happen very soon, 2020, 2021, even earlier in some countries, which is not going to, it's going to be a huge change for operators, because until today 4G is a matter of connectivity and bandwidth, but 5G is really going to provide a lot of services, so you will have some slicing parts of the network. So you will have some services for the cars, you will have some services for the drones, you will have some services for medical device. So really, I think that for operators, it's going to be a huge and major change. And I would say accelerating the change to, as I said, a hardware company to a software and application company.
Yeah, integrating what Pierre-Louis was saying about the 5G, probably it's interesting to say that we see 5G as not a substitution or an evolution of the other 4G, 3G, whatever it is, but it's a bandwidth on top. And as soon as we deliver 4.5, 5G, whatever it is after, we need to, on top, manage the new bandwidth that will be, by sure, increasing the capacity request all over the world. In terms of, well, I found very interesting the fact that in the last years we were talking about the substitution. Do you remember the substitution of the wireless, the wireline? Mm-hmm. Wireless will take over, there will be only access with mobile. This is not. 3 years ago, 4 years ago, 5 years ago, we were very, very pessimistic on the evolution of the fixed network, on the access fixed in each domestic countries. Very pessimistic. Now we see that there is a boom of requests coming from the fixed, and I see also from the mobile point of view that they think, oh, what is happening? I was the first lady just 2 years ago. Now it is becoming fiber optics to the home, the first lady. It's always just for saying that the evolution of the market goes where where's the capability to guarantee more capacities. I mean, technology will be, I'm sure, is a driver, but at the end, any technology that can guarantee fast connection, reliability, accessibility, whatever it is, will drive the evolution of the market. Mm-hmm. Probably, we don't know. It's fiber to the home. After, we don't know what will be the new way how to connect the people and to guarantee reliability and services in the future. But I'm sure it's bandwidth request, specifically the evolution of the market.
I'll offer an adjunct to that. The technology driver is a critical element, but most people here in the room are on the wholesale commercial side. And traditionally, they've been given by their product teams models in order to manage those relationships. Technological evolution, software evolution, as we've described on the panel right now, has given rise to some vacuum or some vagueness with regard to the specifics of the wholesale commercial model between physical infrastructure providers and software applications providers, so to speak. And if that wholesale model can be identified with some clarity, with better clarity at least for the attributes associated with the model, so that the specifics can be worked out by people in this room commercially on a point-to-point basis, I think that we'll see more agile movement for the industry. That is to say, the software-based applications, or as Dan referred to them, the clouds like Amazon and Google, or in Asia, Alibaba or Tencent, these guys are building the software-based applications to facilitate payments, to facilitate enterprise behavior, and whatever the case may be. We're building out physical networks, but the customers actually want both. And if there are more ubiquitously defined wholesale relationships between the software application layer and the physical network layer, I think you'll see even greater movement on both sides of the equation.
Very interesting. So we've still got some way to go, actually, in terms of sort of merging those two environments. You know, the ambition's there, but when you drill into the detail, there's much further to run. If we sort of think about, and again, we've been talking very big picture about sort of global trends. I know that we've introduced some regional specificities to that. But if I look at, say, the increasing role of the public sector in telecoms policies going forward, and the importance of digital society regulation. Do we see sort of the trajectory for different regions evolving in a different way due to political and regulatory pressures or nuances? Is that something that we should factor into our horizon watching?
Wait, we're going to end this on regulatory discussion?
Well, there's a lot of sort of fragmentation, I guess, of approach, and I think, even this morning here, we're hearing from representatives from, national governments, regional policymakers. Is that something that may affect ultimately the dynamics of demand going forward?
Yeah, so I don't know the answer to that question, but there are two things that I think we should all be kind of cognizant of, just to kind of end this on a note that I think will stimulate a little bit of thought. There's two things that have been largely true since the beginning of civilization that are about to change in a way that's going to affect bandwidth in a gigantic way. So two things that have been true since as long as civilization can remember. One is there's only been one computer science. Okay, it's been about ones and zeros, whether it's an abacus or today's most powerful computer. It's about the manipulation of ones and zeros. That's on the verge of changing through quantum computing, where it's not about bits, it's about qubits, which will require the development of a whole new computer science that will involve kind of physics and ramifications that are just something different than any of us could have imagined, such as teleportation, such as computer science that solves every encryption code that has been invented to date and solves it instantaneously. There's an article in the New York Times about Google having a leadership position in that, but this is happening throughout universities and through a lot of the major research firms, and that's going to become real, maybe not in the careers of most of the people in this room, but certainly in the careers of our children. So that's one. And the second one is, as far back as you can look, no matter how much wealth you created, no matter how much you're able to give to your children, one thing you couldn't do, even if you were the king of England, you couldn't give your children better genes. Okay, everyone was born from the same gene pool. That too is about to change. That's about to change with the ability of money can buy you kind of genetic advantages, perhaps, which will have massive regulatory implications, but that too will open up kind of the world to new challenges, opportunities, technologies, most all of which will involve big data and therefore lots of bandwidth and lots of cloud. So I think we all got a lot to look forward to in our careers.
No, that's great. That's great. And certainly there is, a lot of opportunity out there. But I guess it's just how you define it and how you shape it, and look at it near term, but also look at it further out. I mean, before we end today's panel discussion, are there any sort of closing thoughts like Dan's, and maybe just a perspective that we can leave the audience with in terms of what's top of mind for you as you take that sort of 5-year view of your organization and the wider industry?
For me, it's, my thought is, I see I'm optimistic on the future. I don't know exactly if it will be wholesale, retail, that will be positively impacted as the evolution of the technology in the market would be, but in any case, I see in the telecommunication a lot of potentiality, opportunity. We are facing in Europe a new era of media companies that are integrating as well in US. Have you seen AT&T and Time Warner? A lot of new model has been proposed by the media company, for example, and then we are looking very close at what is happening because this can benefit also the telecommunication. Actually, we have a shareholder that is Vivendi. It's media, more media than telecommunication. So it's lots of things to learn. In theory, what I want to say is integration. Integration, network integration, interoperability, service integration. The objective, how to increase customer experience. how to get the maximum level of customer experience, whatever it is, looking at the smartphone devices, machine to machine, would be the inclusion of technology in our life will be so big, so massive, that we have to think really about what would be the rules of the game. And this bring value, in any case bring value. That's why I'm optimistic.
Great, fantastic. And Mark, any final thoughts?
I've often said to my own team, and perhaps I'll share publicly, I think that particularly in conferences like this that are facilitated by capacity and so on, there are obviously formal discussions that take place bilaterally, but also an enormous amount of informal relationships amongst all of us here in the room. Many here are trying to make their targets or commissions or whatever it may be, but the informal relationships here, particularly in changing times, both politically and I would say, whether or not you believe in global warming or not, no, it's inarguable that there are certainly changing weather patterns that impact the capacities that we manage. Please leverage the informal relationships and try not to exploit adversity and instead facilitate what we're all about here, which is to assure that the world can communicate with whatever new technology evolves, because I think it's quite valuable. And hopefully everyone here is cherishing the time that they're putting together to make sure that we're interconnected.
That's great, Mark, thank you. And Pierre-Louis, maybe just turning to you finally.
Just like Alessandro, I'm very optimistic because, again, the demand from the retail customers is really increasing very much. So based on that, behind our wholesale industry needs to adapt. Of course, we need to adapt. If we don't adapt, we'll die. But based on this growing demand, which will continue to even increase, I'm very optimistic for what we have in the future.
That's great. That's great. Well, I think we're pretty much at the end of the session. So thank you very much. Thank you to our panelists. And thank you to listening. Thank you to the audience. Thank you.